Wow. All right. So, Discipline and Punish, Part 2, but also Episode 100. So, this went by quick. Less than a couple of years and we already got 100 up, so that's good. But for now, Discipline and Punish, but again, even before that, I should say that this will be found on Podbean and iTunes, so you can find links for that in the description, as well as the Patreon account. That any amount there that you can add or you can pledge would be great. I understand if not, but if you still can't, it'd be worth checking out because there are some funny jokes embedded in there. But yeah, without further ado, on with episode 100. Now this is the stuff that I think most people interested in this text or forced to read it in academia, this is the part that most will have to know, or that most people would be interested in. So some of the key ideas we run through here are docile bodies and the panopticon, including other ones like the carceral state and stuff like that, which are all big ideas, especially anyone going through university right now, wanting to have a better grasp of this stuff. Hopefully I can be of some help. But here we begin with docile bodies. So this is about chapter 5 in my version, which I think is probably the version everyone has, where he begins with the image of a soldier. So a soldier for Foucault is someone who internalizes order to some extent. Now, I don't mean order in a kind of abstract sense like the social contract or the law or anything like that. The soldier is someone who is controlled to such an extent that every single one of their movements are highly calculated. Like, for anyone that's seen Full Metal Jacket, the line 4 inches from your chest would certainly mean something to you. There's so many specific movements that have to be so carefully executed that a soldier could hardly be thought of as having a kind of autonomy, right? Everything they do is highly controlled and regimented. So he uses this image to make a broader characterization of society at large. So this comes about through a number of different ways that we'll go through here, but to just kind of give a preface to them, things like the panopticon, where people, under fear of being watched, regulate themselves into acting in accordance with the gaze they assume is there, or they meet the expectations that they assume are there. Now this has an effect on people. This renders them docile. So docile being, non-insubordinate, that is, someone who is subordinate, someone who is, I think calm would be a safe adjective to put in there, but is someone that is willing to follow instruction, someone who is malleable to the will of someone in authority. So he gives us a little bit of a definition here, where he says that a docile body is one that may be subjected, used, transformed, and improved. Now this has an interesting effect, and anyone who's interested in the topic of subjectivity will find this interesting, because to be subject to a gaze, to be subject to an authority, means two possible things. Firstly, it constitutes you as a subject, which comes with certain benefits, a certain degree of autonomy. Whereas on the other hand, it renders you a kind of object, ironically, because it makes you the subject of someone else's gaze, kind of controlling you. So the way I like to imagine this is like a child in a sandbox, or anyone in a sandbox, really. Now, in the sandbox, for the child, there might be limitless possibility with what can be done with sand, especially if you include something like water. So they are confined to the sandbox, yet there doesn't seem to be a limit to it. But anyone looking from the outside certainly sees that the sandbox has a limit. And that limit actually, limits what the child can do in the sandbox, thereby limiting their potential as subjects. Yet it is also by virtue of that sandbox that they are given that kind of creative subjectivity. So Foucault is kind of illustrating it in this way, where on the one hand, people are subject to a certain gaze that makes them subordinate to that gaze, that makes them malleable to that gaze, that is bendable, that is adaptable to that gaze. But at the same time, it grants people a certain degree of autonomy. So in order for this kind of disciplinary apparatus to work for Foucault, it needs to look at things individually. So we kind of got a glimpse of that in the first episode when there was a shift from looking at people as being, criminals or not, to, taking into account everyone's personal history, taking into account whether or not someone might have other kinds of ailments like mental disorders that need to be taken account of, accounting for people's like home situations, accounting for people's status and class and all that Foucault says presents a very interesting turn in the way that discipline is organized, because it doesn't just cast or just cover the general population with a big blanket and says this is how we administer punishment. Now it looks at each individual case, and it is through that each individual internalizes themselves as being a subject, an individual autonomous subject. Now Foucault wants us to come out of that to recognize that this subjectivity is not bestowed upon us in a benevolent way. That is, it doesn't come to us in a good way. Instead, it is something that is given to us to better control us. Now, the process by which this happens is really complicated. And I want to say here that over the next few chapters, Foucault gives us many lists. Now, for anyone familiar with Foucault's thought, he likes to really delineate his approach in numbered lists. So he gives us like 4 different reasons why something happened, or 3 different reasons, and then explains each of them. Where there are really, in some cases, really minuscule differences between, one point and another. So while what I'm going to be doing for the rest here might seem like I'm reading like a grocery list, that is the case, because that is exactly what we're presented with here, and I can't very well skip it. So what I'm going to do is try to be as clear, precise, and quick with them as I can. But he gives us a kind of roadmap as to how these docile bodies were formed. Now, what I will say before then is that for him, these docile bodies came into being when people were rendered or sought to be made productive. Now, what does that mean? Well, when we take a factory, for example, what the factory owner wants to do is to maximize the productivity of the individual while minimizing the kind of cost behind it, right? Marxist theory right there. But for Foucault, what he says is that this possibility isn't simply the product of a kind of capitalist mentality. That is, it's not the product of a desire for profit. While he does give that a lot of attention, he says that there was something else going on. And he says that this emphasis on docile bodies, or this move towards docile bodies, really came about, and he says in quotes here, when the art of the human body was born, which is an interesting claim, because, of course, the body's been around forever. How can we claim the body was just, or the art of the body was just born? Well, what he means by this is that suddenly, with all the kind of expert medical gazes that were placed on the body, it gave the body a kind of status. It gave the body a kind of essence that it didn't always have. Now, with this moment, the body could be reduced to infinitesimal little parts, right? Physiologically, people knew what was going on in the body, therefore they could have a better understanding of how it worked. And by virtue of that, they were able to then kind of construct new and effective ways to make that body productive. So knowing what, the human body was capable of, then suddenly people could optimize its productivity. So this might seem to be like the same as the Marxist thing, that is trying to maximize it. But Foucault says that what Marx forgets, or if Marx wasn't aware of, is that there were these other mechanisms going on that don't necessarily have a link to capital in the way that Marx would like to suggest, and that these forms of control in many ways antedate, or they come before, the introduction of capital, and capital just used them And of course, Foucault says that you use them en masse, and that's something we have to consider. But anyways, that was a little bit of a longer preface than I wanted. He says that this came about through 4 different mechanisms, or 4 different mechanisms kind of operated to create these docile bodies, and they are as follows. Number 1, through the art of distributions. Number 2, for the control of activity. Number 3, the organization of geneses. And number 4, the composition of forces. Now, each of these 4, and really bear with me, I'm going to repeat them often so that, you don't have to worry about remembering them. These 4 all participate together to create these docile bodies. And they each correspond to another kind of mode of individuality that must all kind of work in harmony to create these docile bodies. So let me repeat them here, including the other titles they have. So these 4 ways are the art of distributions, that was the first one, that Foucault says is the cellular mode of individuality. There's the control of activity, which he calls the organic mode of individuality. Thirdly, the organization of geneses, which he calls the genetic mode of individuality. And fourth, the composition of forces, which he calls the combination of individuality. So I want to read a little section that explains these other 4 titles, that is the cellular, the organic, the genetic, and the combination. So he says that it is the cellular, which is by the play of spatial distribution. It is organic by the coding of activities. It is genetic by the accumulation of time. It is combinatory by the composition of forces. And in doing so, it operates 4 great techniques. It draws up tables. It prescribes movements. It imposes exercises. Lastly, in order to obtain the combination of forces, it arranges tactics. Tactics, the art of constructing, with located bodies, coded activities, and trained aptitudes, mechanisms in which the product of the various forces is increased by their calculated combination, are no doubt the highest form of disciplinary practice. So that's how the 4 of them organize around one another to produce this effect of docile bodies. So now let's move into each one of them one by one. So number 1, the art of distributions. So traditionally, if we thought of confinement, what was meant by distribution was a very kind of rigid closing off people from, society, where, you would confine them in solitary confinement and that would be it. They would be away from society at large. Now, with the introduction of other various institutions like prisons, schools, factories, anything like that, what we see is the creation of zones where these disciplinary effects are meant to exert themselves over the people within them. So when you enter a hospital, you are, like, if you have an illness, you are coded through that illness, and various different mechanisms are then operated on you because of that illness, all with the goal of rendering you normal again. Now, with this kind of framework, there's a steady kind of bifurcation, that is a split between the inside and the outside, right? So you have those people in the walls, in the institution, that are markedly different from those outside of the walls. So far, this art of distributions is working on a kind of broader scale. So what does it mean to belong to an institution? What does it mean to exist within walls that are trying to confine you? So he adds to this that the disciplinary mechanisms that he's trying to delineate, that is, he's trying to explain here, aren't nearly as rigid. In fact, he says that what we see are the creation of as many spaces of confinement as there are bodies. Now, this relates very well with the idea of the individuality, where people are seen as being, individual entities that need their individual care. So therefore, we need individual treatments of that body. So instead of there being large macro spaces for the confinement of people and their control, now there are specific ones where each person goes into their specific camp and they are dealt with in that way. But still, we don't really get the full form of the art of distributions yet. Foucault says that it develops even further as soon as we introduce a kind of administrative mechanism to this individual separation of people in accordance with their specific needs, with their specific quote-unquote problem. Now you introduce a certain administrative effect that is meant to kind of survey, that is meant to control, that is meant to code where these people are, what they should be doing, what would constitute their re-entering abnormality, that is, having agreed upon what is normal and are able to then condemn anything that falls outside of that range. Only with that we move a little bit closer to this full form of the art of distributions for the production of docile bodies. So this only comes to the fore, this only gets fully developed, again, we're working under the art of distributions here, when we see the introduction to this administration, a kind of hierarchization, or what he calls a kind of cellular power, which is an interesting term, and only reading it now for I don't know how many times I've read this book, 2 or 3 times, did this really stick out to me, this idea of cellular power, because it's not a term that really floats around Foucauldian discourse all that much. But anyways, it's interesting. And what it suggests is that in order for the art of distributions to have the effect of producing docile bodies, there needs to be a control administered by some kind of space or from some kind of people. Now those people are, let's take a factory for example. Those people are the supervisors, who are then watched by the managers, who are then watched by the, owners, who are then watched by the shareholders, anything like that work in this kind of compartmentalized way to control very specifically the people underneath, to mandate, to make sure that they all operate in order. Now that propels us here from the art of distributions to the second one, titled The Control of Activity. And this is the control of time. So this goes through a few different steps. Firstly, the time of day must be strictly administered. So people get up in the morning, they must eat breakfast, start eating breakfast by 6:30. By 7, they have to be in church for mass, and then 7:30 they have to show up for their kind of work duty. At noon they eat lunch again. At 12:30 they have half an hour for recreation. Then at 1 they have back to work duty till 5, and then dinner, and so on and so forth, where everything is very specifically calculated, very specifically mapped out. Now to this he adds what he calls the temporal elaboration of the act, or what he calls the anatomo-chronological schema. So this is not just the mapping of the entire day, but the mapping of the specific movements of the body. So again here he uses the example of the soldier. Now the soldier, specifically soldiers marching, where they are to march on beat, and that beat is determined by time. So it's in that way that time becomes internalized by the body itself, where let's say part of your labor is using a pickaxe, like it might be you might be working that pickaxe to a certain chant or to a certain rhythm that is meant to kind of keep you in a state of, you kind of fall into the rhythm and lose sight of yourself in that process. And what this creates is a kind of correspondence between the body and the gesture, what he calls the gesture, or the act that is being done, which is meant to optimize the body's productive capacity. So there is no surprise then that there is an extension from the rhythm of the body to the rhythm between the subject, as we've understood it now, the person being subjected to this authority, between the subject and the object they're using. So if they're using a gun, like in the case of the military or a soldier, then there's a kind of dynamic interplay between that object and the subject. Now, anyone familiar with cybernetics would perhaps have something to say about this, because the foundations of cybernetics is to kind of disturb the supposed split between, the objects people use and those people, where with the dynamic interplay between the two, you can produce much more effective results, much more productive capabilities on the part of both the object and the subject. Now, all of these kind of controls over time and the regulation of the body are not meant to suppress or repress. They are not meant to kind of control the body into not doing things. It is instead making the body do things, but making it do things in the most productive way it can. So he creates a distinction here between, the timetable, which was a very rigid, calculated thing that was more caution against what the person can't do than what they can do, versus this discipline, which wants people to proliferate, which wants people to be productive, but they want that productivity to be optimized. And it is with this shift that we see the shift from what he calls the mechanical body, that is the body that is very rigid, kind of set out through various mechanisms, to the natural body, a body that internalizes the authority imposed upon it as being natural, giving birth to the idea of themselves as natural. So there's very little chance then to question it. And that moves us into number 3, the organization of geneses, which is essentially the capitalization of this time. So if there's an organization of time going on, this organization of time needs to be very well calculated so that every single event in the day is very clearly split from another one. And they must try to restrict one, bleeding into the other or two overlapping, because then that creates confusion. And that isn't necessary because it has to be as simple as possible, lest, the rhythm gets disturbed and people fall out of their kind of habitual, regular routine, their movement, and therefore thereby become unproductive. And it is only with a kind of increasing in the complexity of the act itself, should the time, or should the organization of time itself get complicated. But that can only come through various procedures, through each, the person, the body being acted upon, internalizes their docility as it goes on. So they become more and more docile as things get more and more complex, so that the complexity does not take them outside of that docility. And because this risk is always there, then there's the introduction of a kind of debriefing or a kind of analysis or studying of those people, or examination, to make sure that they are staying within the parameters of the system. So they'll get, asked questions if they feel like if the supervisor feels like the person is falling out of line, they'll be examined, cross-examined in accordance with their previous work habits to see if they are in fact being as productive as they can be. Now this is a regulatory mechanism that is meant to keep people who fall outside, or at least appear to fall outside of the limits imposed upon them, to kind of impose upon them a control, to kind of bring them back into the system. And then finally here, and again, we're still under the organization of geneses, another effective tool they use is to rank the docile bodies to some extent, what I'll call the docile bodies here, to rank the subjected people, so that you have, supervisors among the people. You have, the class head, or the class leader, or, the squad leader, or whatever, little things like that are meant specifically to kind of regulate from the inside, so that the other people know that amongst themselves, so not just a kind of what at times might be an abstract, non-present superior, like a supervisor, manager, or something like that. Now they know that among themselves are these kind of police that can rat them out. And then finally here he gives us the fourth one, the composition of forces. So there's a kind of individuality presented here. And again, he gives us the example of the soldier, where we have a soldier with a rifle, and that soldier-rifle dynamic presents an individual enterprise that has internalized all these other forces, internalized all these other processes, sees themselves as being an individual subject that has naturalized that understanding, and can then be, super productive in that way. Now we can contrast this with a previous form of military organization. To bring it into pop culture, for anyone that's seen the film 300 with Gerard Butler, they present in that movie what's called a phalanx. Now, a phalanx is when people, soldiers are put in a line with a line of soldiers behind them and a line of soldiers behind them. And what each line does is kind of hold the line in front of them forward to kind of keep them sturdy. And so what this is effective at doing is creating a kind of rigid, impenetrable kind of fortress of individuals that come together to form a mass. Now, what we see here is taking the phalanx apart, making it stubbornly individual. Now, there's actually a lot to say about the phalanx because it's part of my research. Historically, the phalanx comes and goes depending on the kind of societal organization that it comes from. So authoritarian regimes in history, or what we perceive to be similar to that, like with a totalitarian rule, actually eschew. They get rid of the phalanx in favor of more individualistic warfare, which is interesting, but it's for another day. So this individuality comes through in through a number of ways. So the people are not measured by their kind of excellence. They are not measured by their own, how they stand above the crowd. They are instead measured by what Foucault calls their position. So where they exist as their body that they've internalized as being natural, their own, real, then becomes their identity. So they, by virtue of that, they do not seek to extend beyond that domain. And all of these different individual enterprises have to be organized in a very specific way so that they don't fall outside of that regime. There's no surprise there. The kind of commands issued towards them have to be clear and brief, lest, people get confused, so that they would know what to do even if they do not get those demands. So we saw this in the first episode with how punishment was being administered, where if the punishment was seen as arbitrary or always random in relation to the crime, people would then not associate their act of the crime with a specific punishment, which proved not to be very effective. And that wraps up here Docile Bodies, which puts us into chapter 6, titled The Means of Correct Training. Now we're going to get a lot of repetition here, and I'm going to try to sift out to make sure that we don't repeat too much, but just a heads up. So it's here that he lays out how discipline works. So not necessarily in the production of docile bodies, but what the actual disciplinary mechanism looks like. And it works through 3 different ways. And they are separation, analysis, and differentiation. So this was essentially accomplished with 3 instruments, and that was hierarchical observation, normalizing judgment, and examination. So in this framework, examination is the product of the first 2, which, to reiterate, are hierarchical observation and normalizing judgment produce examination for Foucault. So number 1 here, hierarchical observation shows that to be seen is not a good thing, whereas to see shows that you wield power. So the one doing the seeing controls the one being seen. So we see this with various architectural transformations that occurred in the 20th century and earlier. Like the office space became a space where everyone could see everyone else, where schools were created in such a way as to make people all visible to the administration, to the teachers, to anything like that, and so on and so forth. Because that signals to Foucault that the act of seeing gives someone a kind of control. Now this opened up a whole new regimen of control that wasn't reduced or isn't reducible as it was in the past to a kind of single point of power. Suddenly we could see opening up a whole new spectrum of supervisory roles. So you have the teacher supervising, you have the administration, you have the principal, you have the lunch monitors, you have I'm talking about the school here. All of these different people kind of take on the role of the ruler, And so it's rendered kind of multiplicitous. It's rendered cellular. It's rendered capillary. That is, it exists, this gaze comes from everywhere and can look everywhere. So it's in this way that we see power moving in so many different directions, where anyone takes on this role of the powerful. If a student takes on the role of the rat, then they, wield power, even though previously, under the rule of kings, no such person could have that power. They were simply, all people were subjected to the king or queen or whoever's gaze. Now, if you couple that with normalizing judgment, then you produce examination. So what is this normalizing judgment? So with this was introduced a whole new kind of understanding about what constituted acceptable and unacceptable activity. So if you internalize that, that is, if supervisory people internalize that, then they are able to regulate, what is considered normal or abnormal. And this doesn't necessarily need to come out in ways like, oh, I'm going to send this person to the principal's office. It can come about through simple judgment, being very, being rude, looking down upon people, making comments to people. And this is only exacerbated when we consider like the internet. That is the normalization machine par excellence. But to be truly effective, Foucault says that it must balance punishment and reward. So then you have, in school you have the gold star system or something, where if someone acts extremely normal and they follow that rule, then they get, the gold star. And if they amass a certain number of gold stars, then they can have an extra 15 minutes of a break. And then with that, people come to then, exalt. They come to strive for these kind of supervisory roles because then they get to be that authority that determines that, which is then seen as a privilege, which is, Foucault says is obviously not great. So with this, we see a kind of simultaneous normalization as well as an individualization, where people are seen on their in their own terms. So someone is recognized as coming from, in the case of the school, from a poor family, and by virtue of that, like, they don't have the best food for lunch, or they don't have the best clothes, or maybe they're shy, they're distant from the rest of their peers. And so by virtue of that, they are marked. And then, the supervisors recognize that and they say, oh, we know what is wrong with you. What is wrong with you is that you come from this background. So our duty is to then, having recognized that, prescribe the correct form of control, the correct form of regulation, the correct form of kind of correction to then make you normal again. So it's in this way we see simultaneous individualization as well as a kind of homogeneous endpoint, that is normalization, that has been established in advance. So that's what this normalizing judgment is. Now that course, in addition to hierarchical observation, produces, as I said, examination. Now what is that? What is examination? This is quite simply the act of perpetually examining people and through that kind of discerning how far away they stray from the normal. And then it's through that they are then prescribed the right mechanism, prescribed the right correction to come back to normalcy. But that examination must be ubiquitous, it must be perpetual. It doesn't just come about like arbitrarily from the king's emissary that comes in, or the magistrate or something that, tries to dictate how things should be. It happens always and forever. Now, this is very closely tied to this idea of knowledge and power that is so important to the Foucauldian, lexicon. And this operates in three ways. You see what I mean? There's list upon list upon list. I hope I haven't lost anyone. We're gonna make it through this. So this produces knowledge and power in three ways, or knowledge with power. So number one, visibility becomes an exercise of power, right? As we've said, the act of seeing gives someone a certain degree of power. So historically, that wasn't reserved for anyone except the people in power, and it instead became something that was kind of democratized. And then it is through that a kind of knowledge of the body can emerge, or knowledge of the individual can emerge, that, the power kind of regulates, mandates. So that's the first way. Now the second way is through examination that introduces a kind of individuality to that person. So this comes about by having the person be entered into documents, into ledgers, into spreadsheets, into tables as an individual, person, right? Where on these sheets or on these tables or whatever, they are coded with whatever individual problem they have, which reinforces their individuality, which when it becomes natural, then it becomes all the more difficult for them to recognize that individuality is actually bestowed upon them to control them, and that it doesn't just come from the benevolent other. And what it also does is make each person a kind of site for knowledge, where each person can be understood in their own way, which then feeds back into those expert gazes that seeks to expand their discipline. And I don't mean I mean discipline like their field, like their field of expertise, because then, you can introduce various new problems, various new mental disorders, like with the DSM, that all seek to kind of find new ways of controlling people, new ways of recognizing what can be wrong with people, and thereby finding new ways to correct people, to bring them back into normalcy. And then thirdly here, this knowledge and power comes about through the documentation and observation just outlined, that all works to make in his words, the individual a case, where they are their own individual case that needs to be corrected. Now what this does is it validates power's intervention. So the powerful being the psychiatrist, for instance, that can then say, or this is the process. It sees a person that is abnormal and says, this person needs to be corrected. Only that person, the psychiatrist, who has recognized them, who has kind of diagnosed them, then has the means to correct that person, because they recognize something in there that they have created, right? It's something that belongs to their kind of field, to their disciplinary lexicon, to their disciplinary domain. And then it is by virtue of that, if they are effective at quote unquote curing the person, making them productive for society once again, that they then have recourse to say, look, we work as an institution. Now there's no point in there when anyone interrogates that very diagnosis in the first place, where people say, or people might refute it and be like, okay, wait a second. Why do we consider something wrong with the person that, is depressed, for example? Like, why is it that we live in a world that says those people who are depressed need to be corrected to fit that world? It's never, what is wrong with that world that makes the people feel depressed? So it transfers the responsibility from what might be a messed up world, what might be a messed up system of surveillance, to the individual. Now, all of this logic is extended from these kind of specific zones, like the psychiatrist office, the prison, the hospital, anything like that, onto the general population, where almost everyone is seen as having something wrong with them that can be corrected, that can be improved. If you have a little bit of anxiety, that is something to correct. If you have trouble focusing in class, that is something to correct. If you are someone that likes to party, that is something to correct, unless you're in university, and then it's okay. But the minute you leave it, then it's like, that is something that we must correct. And it's so arbitrary. It's strange, but it's, yeah. Okay, now the real kicker into chapter 7, Panopticism. So he begins this chapter by illustrating a small village being affected by the plague. So if the plague arrived in a town, a few various measures were taken to kind of contain it. So there was a prohibition to leave the town on pain of death, the killing of all stray animals, the division of the town into distinct quarters, each governed by an intendant. All of these things were meant to kind of control and contain the outbreak. So in this moment, the military kind of takes it upon themselves to embody a gaze that is meant to kind of keep people in line. So in response to the plague, power instills order. Like it takes things back almost to like a previous form of control. But, don't want to say that too firmly quite yet, but just for now, imagine as being like strict order that is meant to keep people, quote unquote, safe. Now, something interesting happened in response to this kind of order, because there emerged a festival, a kind of a locus of anti-order, where people could mingle and shed their identity, kind of emerged in response to it, which was an interesting thing, because surely that would be a way to spread the disease. But anyways, but even more interestingly, Foucault says that people weren't spending each of their days kind of waiting for this festival as a kind of festival as a way to kind of shed their ordered identity. Because it also revealed to Foucault that to some extent people really liked the order imposed upon them because it gave them an identity, or what he calls a true name, a true place, a true body, a true disease. So those people that were considered sick, there was something like fascinating about it, because they were then seen as this kind of like pure being that was no longer just invisible to everyone else. Like they became a person in that, which is super ironic. But we can see here how there's a kind of similarity between how we've been constructing this image around docile bodies with what we are seeing here, where people become subjects under a certain order, and how that order, gives people a sense of self that they otherwise might not have had. So what this shows to us is that even going so far back as leprosy, that Foucault takes some time to talk about, and for those who want more on that, check out his book Madness and Civilization, which I also did episodes of here that might be worth checking out. But he contrasts leprosy, or the treatment of leprosy, with the treatment of the plague here. Where with leprosy, people were just kind of cast out of society. If you were a leper, you were cast out, or you were sent to kind of camps where you just sit there pretty much all alone, or among other lepers. And that produced what he called a kind of pure community, where people, lepers, were people that would be among themselves as lepers, which kind of kept them, they weren't individualized in that way. In fact, they were kind of rendered more communal, because they were only part of their kind of people that had some kind of affinity with them. Whereas with the plague, under a kind of disciplinary mechanism, where each person is kind of quarantined on their own, where they can be checked in by a doctor, repeatedly, many times a day or a few times every few days, it gives them a sense of identity that transcends the kind of community, that gives them a kind of special identity. So the act of being watched gives people both a subjectivity and a lack of subjectivity, or makes them subjected to a kind of gaze. And here we enter the panopticon. Now, I'm sure everyone knows about this who's listening to this, but for those that might not know, the panopticon is a structure produced by Jeremy Bentham that was meant to be a benevolent way to kind of contain people. So Jeremy Bentham saw a problem with how prisons were run, because they were susceptible to like retaliation, to violence, to mutiny. I don't know if that's the right word, but where what he designed in response to that was a prison where people would supposedly self-regulate. Now, what did this look like? Well, it had a very specific architectural design. So it was a ring. It was a circular structure, where within the circular structure, there was a big open courtyard in the middle. So this ring kind of circled this center kind of courtyard. Now, the cells were placed one on top of the other, and then one next to each other within the ring, where the bars of the cell were facing this inner courtyard. Now, in the middle of the courtyard was a watchtower. Now, the watchtower was designed in such a way as to make it so that the prisoners, because of various blinds, wouldn't be able to see the people in the watchtower, but the people in the watchtower could see the people, the prisoners. And every one of the prisoners knew this. So the idea that Jeremy Bentham had was that if people feel like they're always being watched, there doesn't actually need to be anyone in the watchtower. If they feel like there's a chance they're being watched, they will then control their actions. So one of the ways I like to bring this into the present day is the example of someone driving in the desert, on a street in the desert, and you come across a stop sign, and you can see for miles and miles and miles that there's no one around. There's no one anywhere. In fact, with 100% certainty, you will not get in trouble if you speed through the stop sign. Now, obviously, I can't speak for anyone or for everyone, but many people, for some reason, stop at the stop sign, which is a very interesting phenomenon. Because if the purpose of the stop sign is to not just to regulate people, but it gives off the signal that it is meant to keep people safe, because if you stop at the stop sign, you're not going to get into a car accident. If you take on that role yourself of the person keeping yourself safe, that is, you can see for yourself that there's no harm that is going to be done to you by just driving through the stop sign, you still stop. Because for some reason, we have internalized the fact that our own well-being, we can't be trusted with it. It has to come from outside, which I think it's a pretty good example of this internalization of a kind of regulation that we come to normalize. So to kind of go back to the panopticon structure, Foucault contrasts it with the dungeon. So both are meant to kind of enclose people. That is, both are meant to keep people in cells. But whereas the dungeon is meant to deprive of light and to keep people away from sight, the panopticon is meant to show people and to make them visible, or to make them visible and by virtue of that make them seeable. And it is through that it produces what he calls homogeneous effects of power, because it normalizes, while, let's keep it in mind, it also individualizes, because it puts people in their individual cell, where they are put there for their individual reason, and then maybe, they're given more time for recess or more time for free time, if depending on their crime or whatever. So these mechanisms, that is homogeneity, that works alongside normalization, accompanies individuality. So he uses this structure to explain society at large, where the panopticon can be seen everywhere, like schools, factories, anything like that, kind of emulate that framework, emulate that structure. Now, what that means is that it can essentially minimize the number of people needed to manage it, because the true panopticon doesn't actually need anyone in the watchtower to be effective. So it can minimize the number of people needed to mandate it, to keep it going, while maximizing the number of people it watches, it controls. So that is why it is so effective, because it doesn't need a kind of central operator, which does the dual task of making it really productive, and it also kind of absolves anyone of any guilt of being, the person in the watchtower that can be easily identified as, the bad person. And in that way, it is democratically run, which is why Foucault says that's why no one wants to challenge it, because not only is it so ubiquitous that it's not really recognized, but everyone participates in it in one way or another. So the panopticon does three things that resonate with the other kind of lists presented earlier. So it is meant to make people productive. So if people fear they're being watched and they will be punished if they do not follow the rules, then they know to, be as productive as they can so that they don't suffer this punishment, which he says introduces bodies into machinery. Number two, discipline, or the panopticon, extends outside of where we might see it most explicitly like prisons, hospitals, barracks, schools, anything like that, to society at large, essentially, in his words, to circulate in a quote-unquote free state. And it is through that the state is actually able to gain more authority, because people are rendered docile. They're less likely to kind of take on a political aim, and they're more likely then to follow authority as it manifests itself in more explicit forms, like politicians, like presidents or prime ministers or kings or whatever. So in that way, and he makes a very important clarification or qualification here, discipline, as it is indicative of the panopticon, does not replace power as it once existed. It rather kind of infiltrates it, and it makes that power much more effective. And that is because today we still see a kind of like sovereign system where there are people in power, and those people in power should be held accountable. But for some reason, we don't do that, because we see the problem as being much more complicated. We see it as being kind of molecular, right? Instead of recognizing the specific points of power, which of course doesn't mean that's not true, because, men regulating what women are supposed to dress like is a form of power that doesn't happen necessarily by people in authority. Yet it is a kind of panoptic mode of surveillance that proliferates everywhere. So it's in that way there's a simultaneous control happening from everywhere, and a very specific control happening from one specific place in many cases, which puts people at an impasse because they don't know what to go after, what to challenge. Do they challenge capitalism? Do they challenge the patriarchy? Do they challenge Oedipus? Who knows? So interestingly, Foucault says that the panopticon only really arrives on the scene at a certain point. And he says that it only arrives on the scene when there has been a centralized, or when knowledge has become centralized, and there is, quote unquote, an authoritarian search for the truth. Now that's very closely linked to the kind of sciences of the body emerging, or the human sciences, where with the more effective ways of understanding the body, could people be controlled, then you see enter the possibility of the panopticon that knows how to make people productive, which knows how to make people docile, which knows how to make people follow, the rule of normalcy. So it's from here then that we move into the next chapter, titled Complete and Austere Institutions. Now this episode is going to go long because I want to get this all done, so try to stick with us here. We're going to make it through, I promise. So he says here, right off the bat, that the idea of prison reform is a misnomer, which seems strange, because he was someone that advocated for prison reform in his own political life, but he says that it's a misnomer because the prison is always reforming. The prison, as an effective mode of kind of controlling people, like the panopticon, is always adapting, because it's always meant to kind of adapt to new trends, to new understandings of what is considered normal, and so on and so forth. Now it does this so that it isn't seen as a kind of inhumane, totalitarian, rigid structure. In this way, it's seen as more humane, where, televisions become part of normal life. So the prison introduces televisions, or, conjugal visits are introduced, or, whatever. Things that are supposedly give the veneer, kind of give the semblance of a kind of humanitarian introduction into the prison, that it is anything but. It's just an effective way to be more productive. But the prison still kind of drives at three fundamental principles that keep it afloat, that kind of keep it going. And is there really any surprise that we get another list here? Number one, isolation is a very important part of it. And that is because prisoners will revolt. There's the threat that prisoners might revolt if, they're put together in a room, or they're allowed too much time together. So, people are only meant to be together for short periods of time, like in their recess or in their breaks, and then they are to be sent back to their cells. And then number two, it also works through work, or by instrumentalizing the labor of the prisoners. Now, this is super interesting, but when prisons first started, prisoners were paid. Prisoners were paid for the labor that they did. It's almost like the United States could take a cue from, the 18th century, but whatever. They were paid, but there were people that opposed that idea, very much like today, like, oh, criminals shouldn't be paid. Like they should have thought of that when they broke the law. But even with people being paid, Foucault is a little bit wary. So he says that, sure, this might have some kind of marginal effect on the economy. It might allocate some money to people that, according to the general public, don't deserve it. But Foucault says that what is really effective here and what is really important is the fact that they're working, period. Is the fact that they're working at all. Because it is the work, not the fact that they're being paid or not, that disciplines them. So he says that it doesn't really matter if they're being paid or not, because they're still being controlled. And then finally, number 3, the prison kind of assumes the status of the modulator of punishment, which means that it controls how and for how long people are to be punished. So this is like what he calls a kind of carceral independence. So the right on part of the prisons to dictate the punishment that people suffer, that people are committed to. Now, the way that the prison did this, that is, determine how long people had to be in prison, was to continually draw from kind of bodies of knowledge, like coming out of universities and other kind of studies that would, consider specific cases, that would then see people as being, taking those things into consideration to determine how long people would have to be in prison, which had a very interesting effect for Foucault, and one that I will say right off the bat is very difficult to understand. And that was the introduction of delinquency as a category in the kind of penal imaginary, which propels us here into chapter 9, titled Illegalities and Delinquency. So here he says that the prison was not just a means to deprive people of liberty. It was also meant as a kind of deterrent to future crime. So he gives the example of the chain gang, so people that were working outside of the prisons and that were chained to one another, kind of digging ditches or whatever, that Foucault says was intended to kind of make people realize what would happen to them if they committed a crime. So it's kind of like the spectacle of the scaffold from the first episode, from the first half here. So he says that, but that presented a problem, like the spectacle of the scaffold, because there was a kind of, people began to kind of appreciate those prisoners as being workers, which had the reverse effect that was intended. So then from that, people were kind of cast into more obscure kind of working roles. So from there, he kind of jumps to say that prisons, despite their efforts to kind of deter crime, don't actually do that. In fact, almost the reverse is the case, where prisons seem to amplify crime. So the most obvious way we can think of this is that people who are convicted of a crime have a very hard time, readapting to society, because society views them as, criminal, and in need then of a kind of, or not in need of anything, in fact, that they don't deserve anything. So that makes them more likely to recommit crimes. Now, what is more, for the criminal who has taken on this status of a kind of delinquent, that is not someone who can at all be exalted as being, someone who's rallying against, the man, like the criminal rallying against power. But the prison kind of births a new way to understand criminals as delinquents, who are seen as a nuisance, not as anyone that can be kind of celebrated. They are seen as being someone who is a shit disturber to the social order. So it is by virtue of that they are the people that the general public comes to hate. Now, whereas the regicide from the first episode, from the first half right at the beginning, was someone who the people might actually agree with, the delinquent, someone who's now sent to prison for, vandalizing, someone who's sent to prison for stealing like bread, for, leaving their mark somewhere, someone who's sent to prison for not paying back a fine or something, is seen as being a nuisance to society at large. And they have nothing redemptive about them, because the acts that they commit are so kind of petty that the prison, where at one time the prison wouldn't have even bothered with that kind of stuff, suddenly made that the focal point. So we see an expansion of the kind of category of criminality to include such petty things that send people, away for so long, like the war on drugs in the United States, which is it's absurd. Like sending people to prison for like the possession of marijuana is like the most strange thing ever. But these people are not celebrated at all, like as criminals, as Foucault described it. They are just seen as problems for society that need to be fixed or need to just be sent to prison forever. So despite the prison's claim to be something that reforms people, that corrects them, in fact does not have that effect at all. So Foucault says, how does it actually get away with that? How does it get away with claiming to do one thing, that is correct people, and in many cases do the exact opposite? And then he gives us an answer to it on 276 to 277, where he says that if this is the case, the prison, apparently failing, does not miss its target. On the contrary, it reaches it, insofar as it gives rise to one particular form of illegality in the midst of others, which it is able to isolate, to place in full light, and to organize as a relatively enclosed but penetrable milieu. It helps to establish an open illegality, reducible at a certain level and secretly useful. At once refractory and docile, it isolates, outlines, brings out a form of illegality that seems to sum up symbolically all the others, but which makes it possible to leave in the shade those that one wishes to, or must, tolerate. So it creates a category that it claims only it itself has the way to correct, that is delinquency, so people then see it as being kind of beneficial institution. So to explain that a little bit more, delinquency is ubiquitous, right? Everyone engages in delinquency, public intoxication, so many people have done that. And it's like a delinquent crime, they can be punished. Foucault says that the prison then makes those things a threat, where at one time people would have been like, whatever, who cares? Makes that a threat that the people then internalize as being a threat, which then the prison is able to supposedly claim to be able to correct, claim to be able to protect people from. Now, because it's ubiquitous, the prison cannot actually perform that function. So what it has done is kind of sealed its fate as the corrector of a crime that can never be fully corrected, thereby sealing its fate to proceed kind of indefinitely in the service of correcting this thing that can't be corrected. And of course, this is all meant to, redirect punishment from people that actually have power to people that don't. So we think of the 2007, 2008 financial crash and how few people went to prison for that, destroying millions of people's lives. No one went to prison for that except like one person. But, possessing marijuana sends you to prison for 20 years. Like Foucault would ask, what is happening here? Why is this person who's done nothing wrong the one who suffers punishment? Because they are considered a delinquent and they are seen as a threat to society because of that. Whereas the person that has real effect on society, because they do not fall under that category, can be given a pass. Because who cares? Who cares? It doesn't happen all that often. It's not everywhere. I don't see it all the time. It's not the homeless person asking for money that really pisses me off. That person who doesn't have the means to pay to have, a place to live is the problem. Because, we see it all the time. We don't see the bankers that are screwing over everyone. So we forget about it. And the prison capitalizes on that forgetting and then reaffirms itself by casting those people that are without power into those spaces, into the prison. And of course, within that, the police serve an instrumental function in maintaining that. They are the regulators. They are the executioners of the prison system. So there's no surprise that there were resistances to this prison formulation because some groups saw exactly what was going on. Like certain Marxist reformists were like, yeah, this is just a way for you to divert attention from the bourgeois onto the poor people. Or anarchists saw this as being a way to kind of go after people without power, to better control them, ostensibly. So there was, resistance here, which is just worth mentioning because he kind of adds that, tacks it on to the end. And here we get to the last chapter. So bear with me, we're almost there. This is titled The Carceral. So he suggests that the carceral system was kind of first emblematized in the 1900s, in the mid-19th century, with the Matre was titled, or Matre, penal colony in France. So the carceral system is like a system of complete, total surveillance and control. And this colony that he describes here in Matre was the kind of ideal form of penality because it embodied the coercive technologies of behavior. So it had within it had a kind of family dynamic, a school dynamic, a military dynamic, a hierarchical dynamic, a juridical dynamic, a working dynamic that were all in the service of maintaining a kind of equilibrium within that state, that an equilibrium of docility. And he says that is there really any surprise that scientific psychology kind of emerged around that time, where people, oh, how convenient, we have all these people in this space who don't fit inside the realm of society at large. Therefore, there must be something wrong with them. Let us begin to ask them questions. Let us begin to find out what it is that is wrong with them. And then from there, you see the emergence of attempts to understand the psyche. And then he finishes off here with one more list that outlines the implications or the kind of effects of transposing this form of penality onto the social body at large. So the first one is that it extends its logic into all domains of life, where every irregularity is cataloged and tries to be corrected, and essentially linked the punitive and the abnormal. So people who were abnormal were the ones to suffer punitive punishment. And then in response to this abnormality, like the punishment, all the institutions that emerged to kind of correct it were inexorably tied to, or inextricably linked to kind of economic situations. So a certain amount of wealth was required to erect these structures that would then primarily inflict its gaze, its kind of punishment onto people without wealth. Then it naturalized this punishment. It made people think that they were deserving of the punishment if it befell them. And it made people who saw other people being punished, them think that the people being punished deserve that punishment. Now, this normality also gave birth to another kind of thing, and that was the inextricable link between legality and nature, where there were kind of natural explanations for this, supposedly, like, you break the laws of nature and nature's going to bite back, like it's going to hurt you. So if you can kind of introduce that narrative into the juridical system, then you find a very excellent way to judge it or to validate it, because people who've, through a kind of knowledge process, have internalized nature as being real, being universal, being natural, then by inscribing that same narrative onto the juridical system, that same juridical system is then able to be universalized, naturalized. So then this gave birth to the normalized examination of people, like prisoners, like people considered mentally ill, which then birthed the kind of scientific examination or investigation of the human, birthing the human sciences. And then finally, it renders the prison, the prison becomes immovable. It, through all these processes, through its naturalization, it becomes unquestionable. And that pretty much finishes us off here, where he gives us the kind of final remark that prison has essentially, through this process, has come to stand in for what justice can be. Where Foucault almost asks us to, wonder, how else can we imagine justice? How else can we imagine, even penality? Like, why is it that we have come to kind of naturalize, justice and its link to the prison? Where he gives us all the examples of how things were so much different at so many different times. But yeah, so that pretty much wraps that up. And for those that listened, thanks. I hope I was of some help. And if not, you know how to leave it. Be sure to check in every Saturday at noon. I'll be back with something else to try to keep the knowledge train